Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going on a journey into one of the most misunderstood parts of history, the Middle Ages. Now, when I say medieval, chances are a few images instantly pop into your head: knights who couldn't stand up in their armor, peasants who never bathed, people who thought the earth was flat, and a world so gloomy that we literally call it the Dark Ages. But here's the thing: most of those images are myths. They've been repeated in textbooks, movies, and even casual conversations so many times that they've started to feel like facts. In reality, the Middle Ages were far richer, stranger, and more fascinating than the caricature we've been handed. Think about it. Would an entire civilization really go 1,000 years without bathing, without science, or without joy? Of course not. But the stories are entertaining, and over the centuries they've stuck. What we're going to do in this video is take 16 of the most popular myths about medieval Europe and break them apart one by one. From the so-called flat earth to the idea that people only lived to 30. From witch burnings to bland food, we're going to replace bad history with real history. So stick around, because by the end of this video you'll see the medieval world in a whole new light. It wasn't just mud, misery, and ignorance. It was colorful, creative, and surprisingly modern in more ways than you'd think. The very first myth we need to tackle is one of the most famous, that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. It's an idea so common that it shows up in movies, cartoons, and even casual jokes. The story usually goes like this. Before Columbus set sail in 1492, everyone thought he would fall off the edge of the world. Columbus, however, was bold enough to challenge this flat earth belief and prove once and for all that our planet is round. It's a dramatic story, but it's completely false. In fact, educated people had known the earth was round for over 1,000 years before Columbus was even born. The knowledge goes all the way back to ancient Greece. Around 240 BCE, a scholar named Eratosthenes used shadows cast in two different cities to calculate the circumference of the earth. His estimate was astonishingly accurate, especially considering the tools available at the time. This scientific achievement was not forgotten in the Middle Ages. It was copied, taught, and passed down in manuscripts, and later in universities across Europe. So if medieval scholars already knew the earth was round, where did the flat earth myth come from? Strangely enough, from much later. In the 19th century, an American writer named Washington Irving published a romanticized biography of Columbus. To make the story more exciting, he imagined a dramatic scene where church leaders mocked Columbus for saying the earth was round. In reality, no such debate ever happened. The real dispute was about the size of the earth, not its shape. Columbus thought the world was much smaller than it really is, which led him to believe he could quickly reach Asia by sailing west. Scholars, on the other hand, correctly argued that the journey would be far longer and more dangerous. Ironically, the scholars were right. Columbus just happened to stumble into the Americas, saving his expedition from disaster. But what about ordinary people? Did peasants and sailors believe in a flat earth? Evidence suggests otherwise. Medieval maps often portrayed the earth as a circle, not a flat sheet. One popular design, the two map, showed the world as a round disc divided into 3 continents: Asia, Europe, and Africa. These maps weren't geographically precise, but the circular shape reflects the belief in a round earth. Sailors also observed how ships disappeared, hull first over the horizon, or how new stars became visible when traveling north or south clear. Signs of a curved planet. It's true that a few isolated writers speculated about flat earth ideas, but they were exceptions, not the rule. The overwhelming majority of educated medieval thinkers, clergy, scholars, and travelers accepted the earth's roundness as basic fact. So why does the flat earth myth still persist today? Because it's a powerful story. It makes the Middle Ages look ignorant and backward, while making modern people feel clever and enlightened. But in reality, this myth says more about the 19th century than about medieval times. Writers like Irving wanted to celebrate progress and cast the past as a time of superstition and darkness. Turning medieval people into flat earth believers was an easy way to do that. The truth, though, is far more interesting. Medieval scholars weren't battling to prove the earth's shape. They were debating its size, its geography, and how far one could travel across it. And far from being ignorant, they were drawing on knowledge inherited from Greece, Rome, and the Islamic world. So the next time someone jokes that medieval people thought ships would fall off the edge, you'll know better. Columbus didn't prove the Earth was round. Everyone already knew that. What he miscalculated was its size, and that mistake nearly changed history forever. Transition. Now that we've set the record straight about the shape of the Earth, let's move to another common misconception, the idea that medieval people never bathed. Another hugely popular myth about the Middle Ages is that people never bathed. If you've seen medieval characters in movies or memes, they're often shown as filthy peasants covered in mud, or lords who never touched water because they thought bathing was dangerous. The stereotype says that medieval Europe was smelly, dirty, and basically allergic to hygiene. But once again, the reality is far more interesting and much cleaner. First, let's talk about the idea of public bathing. From around the 12th to the 15th century, public bathhouses were actually common across European towns and cities. These were not just for the wealthy. Ordinary townsfolk could afford to visit them too. Bathhouses were places for washing, relaxing, and even socializing. They often had hot water, wooden tubs, and steam rooms. In many ways, they were like the medieval version of a spa. We even have records of rulers and nobles who loved bathing. King Henry III of England had a special bathhouse built at Westminster. St. Louis IX of France was known for his regular baths, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. Wealthy households often had servants, heat, water, and fill tubs so their masters could soak in comfort. For nobles, bathing was part of the rhythm of daily life, and it wasn't just about luxury. Cleanliness had moral and spiritual dimensions too. Monasteries, for example, were expected to provide regular bathing facilities. For monks, the rule of Saint Benedict mentions washing hands and feet as a part of religious discipline. Hospitals run by the church also included baths for patients. Far from seeing water as dangerous, medieval people linked washing with health, discipline, and even holiness. So, where does the dirty medieval myth come from? Partly from later centuries, especially the early modern period. By the 16th and 17th centuries, attitudes toward bathing began to change. Some physicians worried that water could carry disease through open pores. In those years, people often shifted from bathing in water to dry cleaning with linen cloths, perfumes, and powders. Over time, that image of dirtiness got unfairly projected backward onto the Middle Ages. Of course, it would be dishonest to say medieval people had modern standards of hygiene. Soap was rougher and less common than today. Bathhouses sometimes doubled as places of prostitution, which gave them a scandalous reputation. And for poor villagers, a daily hot bath wasn't realistic drawing, and heating water was labor. Instead, most people bathed occasionally, supplemented by regular hand and face washing, and by changing linen shirts. Linen was key, because it absorbed sweat and oil, keeping the body fresher. In fact, medieval laundry was often more frequent than bathing, and a clean shirt was a visible sign of hygiene. Travelers from outside Europe also noticed the habit of washing. For example, Arab and Byzantine writers sometimes commented on the bathing customs of Europeans. In many cases, they acknowledged that people did bathe, though often less elaborately than in Islamic lands, where bath culture was highly developed. So while Europeans may not have matched the sophisticated hammams of the Middle East, they certainly weren't the mud-covered savages of stereotype. Another detail, cities like Paris, London, and Prague had entire industries around bath. Some towns even had regulations about opening hours, pricing, and behavior inside them. In fact, in some places, bathhouses were so popular that moralists complained people were spending too much time relaxing in hot water. Not exactly the picture of a culture that avoided bathing altogether. So why does the myth remain so powerful? Because it fits a dramatic contrast. The dirty, ignorant Dark Ages versus the supposedly clean, enlightened, modern world. It makes for a simple, memorable story, even though it distorts the past. The truth, as always, is messier. Medieval people valued cleanliness, but their methods were shaped by the technology, resources, and beliefs of their time. So the next time someone claims medieval people never bathed, you'll know the truth. They did bathe, they built bathhouses, they cared about cleanliness, and for many centuries, they probably smelled a lot better than the stereotype suggests. Transition. With bathing myths washed away, let's turn to another classic cliché, the idea that people in the Middle Ages only lived to the age of 30. One of the strangest myths about the Middle Ages is the idea that medieval people were much smaller than us, that everyone back then was short, frail, and weak compared to the taller, stronger people of today. You've probably heard someone joke that medieval knights would look like children if they wore their armor today, or that people back then were so small because they never ate properly. But does the evidence support this? Not really. In fact, medieval men and women were not as tiny as we often imagine. Let's start with some actual numbers. Archaeologists have studied thousands of medieval skeletons across Europe. What they've found is that the average height of a medieval man was around 5 feet 7 inches, 170 centimeters, and women were around 5 feet 2 inches, 158 centimeters. Now, compare that to modern averages. In many European countries today, men average about 5 feet 9 inches, 175 centimeters, and women around 5 feet for 162 centimeters. That's only a difference of an inch or two. Hardly the tiny people stereotypes suggest. In fact, in some regions and time periods, medieval Europeans were just as tall as their modern descendants. For example, skeletal remains from northern Europe during the early Middle Ages show men averaging close to 5 feet 8, which is nearly identical to today. Heights did fluctuate over the centuries, but the changes were not dramatic enough to justify the myth of miniature medieval. So where did this myth come from? Part of it has to do with armor and clothing that survive in museums. When people see suits of armor that look small, they often assume the knight who wore it must have been short. But here's the catch. Many of those armors were custom-made for teenagers, for tournament display, or for very slim elite nobles. They weren't average examples of the population. It's like judging the average height of people today by looking at mannequins. In a store, they're not always representative. Another factor is malnutrition, but it's more complicated than we might think. It's true that food supplies could be unstable. Famines, especially during the 14th century, caused significant hardship. Malnutrition and disease sometimes stunted growth in certain regions or time periods. But this didn't mean that every medieval person was short. In fact, before the Industrial Revolution, medieval diets were often healthier than those of 18th and 19th century factory workers, who faced poor nutrition in crowded cities. Some historians even argue that peasants in the Middle Ages, who lived on bread, vegetables, dairy, and occasional meat, often ate better than urban workers during the 1800s. We also need to consider that human height is influenced by genetics, as well as nutrition. Northern Europeans, for example, have historically tended to be taller than Southern Europeans, regardless of time period. So a French peasant and a Viking raider might not have stood at the same height, but both would have been within the normal human range, not tiny compared to us. Even medieval art offers clues. Paintings, tapestries, and illuminated manuscripts often show people in proportions similar to ours. Yes, medieval artists had a symbolic style, but they didn't depict their subjects as miniature humans. And when we look at descriptions from chronicles or poetry, height was sometimes mentioned. As a mark of distinction, just like today, tall individuals stood out in a crowd. That only makes sense if the general population wasn't absurdly short. So why do we cling to the myth? Probably because it fits neatly into a larger narrative. The Dark Ages were backward, dirty, unhealthy, and populated by people who were smaller and weaker than us. Believing that reinforces the comforting idea that modern life is superior in every possible way. But history is never that simple. The reality is that medieval people were not dramatically different in size from us. A knight in full armor would have looked impressively large and strong, not like a child in a costume. A medieval peasant walking beside you on the street would probably blend in quite easily. So the next time someone tells you that medieval people were tiny, you can set the record straight. Sure, average height was a little shorter, but not by much. They were real, full-sized human beings just like us. Transition. Now that we've put height myths to rest, let's take on another favorite cliché, the idea that medieval people only lived to 30 years old. If you've ever visited a medieval castle, cottage, or even seen photos of old European houses, you've probably noticed the doorways look surprisingly small. Many tourists duck their heads to get through, and it's a common joke. Wow, people back then must have been tiny. It seems logical at first. Glance, short doors equals short people. But as with most medieval myths, the truth is more practical, and far less about body size. First, let's go back to what we already know. Medieval people were not dramatically shorter than us. Archaeological evidence shows men averaged about 5 feet 7, and women about 5 feet 2, only slightly shorter than today. So clearly, doorways weren't built small just to match miniature bodies. There were actually a variety of reasons why medieval doors, especially in castles and cottages, were often low. The most obvious explanation is heat and insulation. In an age without central heating, keeping warmth inside a home was essential. Smaller doors meant less space for cold drafts to sneak. Enduring winter, combined with thick walls and small windows, low doors helped conserve precious heat. In rural cottages, where fireplaces were the only heat source, every little bit of insulation mattered. Another factor is cost and labor. Building materials, like wood and stone, were valuable, and construction was time-consuming. Making doorways smaller saved resources. In simple village houses, builders weren't aiming for grandeur, they wanted efficiency. A modest doorway was cheaper and easier to make. There's also a defensive aspect, especially in castles or fortified homes. Low doors forced anyone entering to duck down. Imagine being an enemy soldier storming into a hall you'd have to bend, making yourself vulnerable to whoever was waiting inside. In some cases, low doors were a deliberate security feature, not a reflection of body size. We also need to consider changes over time. Many medieval buildings that still exist were altered or reused for centuries. Floors might have been raised, ceilings lowered, or ground levels changed due to rebuilding. What looks like a tiny medieval door today may actually have been taller originally, only shortened after centuries of renovations. Archaeologists have shown that some low doors are misleading because the surrounding structures shifted over time. Then there's the difference between functional doors and ceremonial doors. Not all medieval doors were small. In cathedrals, town halls, and castles, you'll find grand, towering doorways designed to impress and symbolize power. These massive entrances show that medieval builders were perfectly capable of making tall doors. They just reserved them for spaces where height carried symbolic weight. For everyday houses, practicality mattered more than grandeur. Another layer to this myth comes from Romanticism in the 19th century. As people rediscovered medieval ruins, they often projected their assumptions onto them. Seeing low doorways, they concluded, people must have been smaller. The idea spread quickly because it was simple, memorable, and seemed to fit the old stereotype of tiny medievals. But as we've seen, that's not the full story. Think about your own home today. Not every door is the same size. The front door might be large and welcoming, while a basement door, a storage closet, or an attic hatch is much smaller. If future archaeologists judged our entire population by the size of a closet door, they'd come to some strange conclusions. Medieval architecture worked the same way. Different doors served different purposes, and size depended on context. So, while ducking through a low medieval doorway might make you feel like a giant, it doesn't mean people back then were much shorter. It means builders were practical, thrifty, and strategic. Small doors kept homes warm, saved resources, and sometimes even helped defend against intruders. The myth of low doors equals short people survives because it's an easy visual joke, reinforced every time tourists crouch through a castle or cottage, but the evidence tells us otherwise. Medieval people were full-sized humans, and their architecture had practical reasons for being the way it was. Transition. With doors and height myths behind us, let's move on to another famous misconception. The belief that medieval people only lived to about 30 years old. Few phrases are as loaded in history as the Dark Ages. When people hear it, they picture 1,000 years of ignorance, superstition, and cultural stagnation between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. According to the stereotype, learning stopped, science disappeared, and people stumbled through centuries of misery by candlelight. But historians today agree, calling the Middle Ages dark is misleading, and in many ways, completely wrong. The term Dark Ages was actually invented much later. During the Renaissance in the 14th and 15th centuries, scholars like Petrarch looked back at the centuries after Rome's collapse and called them dark, in contrast to what they saw as their own revival of classical learning. In other words, it wasn't that medieval people thought they were living in darkness, it was a label applied by later generations who wanted to glorify their own era. Over time, that term stuck and shaped popular imagination. But if we look closely, the Middle Ages were anything but culturally empty. Far from darkness, this was a period of innovation and preservation. Monasteries across Europe copied and preserved ancient texts, saving much of the knowledge of Greece and Rome that might otherwise have been lost. Medieval universities began to emerge in the 12th and 13th centuries, Oxford, Paris, and Bologna laying the foundations for higher education as we know it today. Science and technology also advanced in surprising ways. The heavy plough transformed agriculture, allowing Europeans to farm more challenging soils. Windmills and watermills spread widely, providing mechanical power for grinding grain, fulling cloth, and even driving simple machinery. By the late Middle Ages, mechanical clocks appeared in town squares, showing remarkable ingenuity. The medieval period also saw breakthroughs in architecture, with cathedrals like Chartres and Notre Dame showcasing advanced engineering and breathtaking artistry. What about art and culture? Far from being lifeless, the Middle Ages were filled with creativity. Illuminated manuscripts glowed with gold and color. Epic poetry like Beowulf and the Song of Roland was composed. The Arthurian legends, courtly love poetry, and Dante's Divine Comedy all belong to this supposedly dark era. In fact, the Gothic cathedrals, with their stained glass and soaring spires, literally filled towns with light. Trade and exploration also flourished. From the Viking voyages to North America, to the bustling markets of Venice and Bruges, medieval Europe was deeply connected to the wider world. Islamic scholars in Spain translated Greek and Arabic scientific works into Latin, enriching European knowledge. Contact with the Middle East during the Crusades brought new foods, ideas, and technologies. Rather than being cut off, medieval Europe was part of a vibrant web of global exchange. Of course, this doesn't mean everything was rosy. The fall of Rome did cause disruptions, especially in the 5th-7th centuries, with political fragmentation and invasions. Literacy rates were lower than in classical times, and wars, plagues, and famines were real hardships. But darkness wasn't the defining feature. Instead, the Middle Ages were a mix of struggle and progress, like any other era. So why does the myth of the Dark Ages survive? Because it's a simple story. It paints history as a straight line. Rome great gives Middle Ages bad, gives Renaissance great again. That neat pattern is easy to teach, but it oversimplifies 1,000 years of history. Modern historians prefer to talk about the medieval period rather than Dark Ages, because it better reflects the richness and diversity of the time. In fact, if you had lived in 12th century Paris, you would have walked among scholars, debating Aristotle, merchants trading exotic goods, builders raising cathedrals, and artists crafting illuminated books. That doesn't sound very dark at all. So, the next time you hear someone dismiss the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, you'll know the truth. Yes, there were challenges and setbacks, but also enormous creativity, innovation, and cultural brilliance. Rather than being an age of darkness, it was a vital chapter in the story of human civilization. Transition. Now that we've shed some light on the Dark Ages, let's tackle another persistent belief, that medieval people rarely lived past 30 years old. One of the most common myths about the Middle Ages is the idea that nobody lived past the age of 30. You've probably heard it in school, documentaries, or casual conversations. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was only 30 years. It sounds shocking, almost as if everyone dropped dead right after their 29th birthday. But the truth is more nuanced and much more human. That the myth comes from a misunderstanding of what life expectancy really means. When historians say the average life expectancy in medieval Europe was around 30 to 35 years, they're including all deaths, even those of infants and children, and child mortality was tragically high. Diseases, poor sanitation, and lack of modern medicine meant that many children didn't survive past their first few years of life. In some regions, up to 1/3 of children died before the age of 5. That statistic pulls the overall average down drastically. But if someone made it through childhood, their chances of reaching adulthood, and even old age, were pretty good. Archaeological evidence and written records both show that many medieval people lived into their 50s, 60s, and even beyond. Monks, nobles, and peasants alike could and did grow old. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine lived into her 80s, and Hildegard of Bingen into her 80s as well. While they were exceptional, they weren't unique. Plenty of ordinary villagers also reached respectable ages. So what did a normal life look like? If you survived childhood illnesses, you could expect to marry in your late teens or 20s, raise a family, and work well into middle age. Farmers, blacksmiths, and artisans often labored into their 50s. Elderly grandparents were part of village life, helping with lighter tasks, childcare, and passing down knowledge. Far from being a world where everyone dropped dead young, the medieval landscape included people of all ages. It's also important to remember that medieval people knew about aging. Literature and art frequently mention the stages of life, from childhood to old age. Some manuscripts even depict the ages of man as a cycle, showing people from infants all the way to grey-haired elders. Clearly, they recognized that long lives were possible and common enough to represent visually. That said, life was undeniably harsher than today. Plagues, wars, and famines struck hard. The Black Death in the 14th century, for example, wiped out up to half the population in some areas, dramatically lowering average life expectancy in those years. But even then, survivors of such disasters often lived on for decades. The myth comes from collapsing those extraordinary events into a general picture of daily life, which is misleading. Modern comparisons also help. For much of history, even into the 18th and 19th centuries, life expectancy was under 40, mainly because of infant mortality. That doesn't mean people in those centuries didn't live long lives. Our own ancestors just a few generations ago often buried children young, but many adults still grew old. The Middle Ages were not unique in this regard. So why does the myth stick? Because people only lived to 30 inches is a simple, dramatic line. It reinforces the broader idea of the Middle Ages as grim and hopeless. But when we dig deeper, we find a society where people loved, worked, aged, and dreamed much like us. Yes, life was shorter on average, but not because adults dropped dead at 30. It was because so many never had the chance to grow up at all. The truth is more balanced. If you survived childhood, you might have lived a life surprisingly similar in length to someone before the 20th century. Elderly people were part of medieval villages, castles, and monasteries. Old age was not a myth, was a reality. So next time someone says, medieval people only lived to 30, you can set them straight. That number reflects the tragedy of infant mortality, not the limits of adult life. People grew old then, just as they do now. It just depended on surviving the rough early years. Transition. Now that we've cleared up the age myth, let's tackle another popular misconception. The idea that medieval food was bland and tasteless. When people think about medieval food, they often imagine grey porridge, stale bread, and maybe a tough piece of meat cooked over a smoky fire. According to the stereotype, meals were monotonous, flavorless, and uninspired. Some even believe spices were used just to cover up the taste of rotten meat. But this image is far from reality. Medieval cuisine was actually rich, varied, and often quite sophisticated. Let's start with the basics. People in the Middle Ages ate far more than just bread and stew. Their diets depended on social class and geography, but across Europe, meals included grains, vegetables, fruits, dairy, meat, and fish. Peasants might not have had daily access to roast beef or fancy desserts, but they certainly enjoyed hearty meals flavored with herbs, onions, garlic, and seasonal produce. Wealthier households, meanwhile, dined on elaborate dishes filled with spices, sauces, and sweet-sour combinations that would surprise modern eaters. One of the biggest myths is that spices were used to cover spoiled meat. In reality, spices were extremely expensive, imported from Asia and the Middle East along trade routes. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, and ginger were luxuries. No one would waste them masking bad food. Instead, spices were prized for their bold flavors, their symbolic connection to wealth and exotic lands, and their role in medieval medical theory, which emphasized balancing the humors of the body. Cookbooks from the Middle Ages also shatter the bland food myth. Manuscripts like Leviandia or the Form of Curie contain recipes that sound surprisingly complex. Imagine roasted meats served with almond milk sauces, or pies filled with spiced fruits and nuts. Sweet and savory were often combined dishes, mixing meat with dried fruits, honey, or vinegar. Far from being boring, medieval cuisine was a blend of strong flavors and creative pairings. Bread, of course, was a staple, but not the plain white loaf we imagine. Bread came in many forms and qualities. Nobles ate fine white bread, made from sifted wheat, while peasants had darker loaves mixed with rye, barley, or oats. Still, bread was fresh, filling, and central to every meal. Vegetables like cabbage, beans, peas, onions, leeks, and carrots were common. Fruitsaples, pears, cherries, plums, and berries were eaten fresh, dried, or cooked into sauces. Dairy products like cheese, butter, and milk rounded out the daily diet. Feasts, meanwhile, were spectacular affairs. Nobles hosted banquets featuring dozens of courses, each more extravagant than the last. Peacocks roasted and then redressed. In their feathers, meat pies sculpted into elaborate shapes. Sugared confections dyed with bright colors. These were designed to impress guests as much as to feed them. Entertainment and food were closely linked, turning meals into theatrical experiences. Even peasants' food was not as dull as the stereotype suggests. Seasonal rhythms meant diets changed throughout the year. In summer, people enjoyed fresh vegetables, herbs, and fruits. In autumn, nuts, grains, and preserved meats filled the table. Winter meals relied more on salted or dried foods, but herbs like parsley, sage, thyme, and dill kept flavors lively. Festivals, fairs, and religious feasts also meant access to richer meals than usual. So, where did the bland myth come from? Partly from the industrial age, when later generations looked back at the Middle Ages as uncivilized compared to modernity. Victorian writers often portrayed medieval food as primitive to highlight their own supposed progress. Hollywood movies reinforced the image with endless scenes of grimy peasants chewing on greasy legs of meat. It was an easy stereotype to sell, but not one based on real evidence. In truth, medieval cuisine was creative, flavorful, and full of variety. It reflected trade connections across continents, cultural exchange with the Islamic world, and the ingenuity of cooks working with seasonal ingredients. If you sat down at a medieval table, you might be surprised at how complex and tasty the food really was. Transition. Now that we've seasoned up the myth about bland food, let's move on to another misconception. The idea that medieval people constantly drank beer or wine because water was unsafe. You've probably heard the claim. In the Middle Ages, people never drank water because it was too dirty. Instead, they drank beer or wine all day long, even children. It's a vivid image: villagers fueled by ale, monks sipping wine with every meal, peasants staggering about half drunk. But while alcohol was certainly common, the idea that people avoided water altogether is a myth. Let's start with the basics. Medieval people did drink water. Rivers, streams, wells, and springs were essential sources of drinking water. Many villages were built near fresh water, and towns invested in fountains, wells, and aqueduct systems to provide clean supplies. In cities like London or Paris, public fountains were maintained so that people could fetch water for cooking and drinking. Archaeological evidence even shows careful construction of wells and cisterns to keep water relatively safe. So why the myth? It comes from two realities. First, that beer and wine were very popular, and second, that water could sometimes be contaminated, especially in crowded urban areas. Without modern sanitation, rivers running through big towns often carried waste. In those places, yes, water could be risky, but it doesn't mean people simply gave up on it. Rather, they knew which sources were safe. Springs, wells, and rural streams were perfectly drinkable. Now, what about beer and wine? These drinks were indeed part of daily life, but not in the way we might think. The key is to understand the difference between small beer or small ale and strong alcohol. Small beer was very lightly fermented, with low alcohol content, often less than 1%. It provided hydration and calories, and because the brewing process involved boiling, it killed off harmful bacteria. Children, workers, and peasants drank it like we drink tea or soft drinks today. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about having a safe, nourishing beverage. Wine played a similar role in southern Europe, where grapes were abundant. Again, it was often watered down, especially for everyday use. People did drink stronger varieties on feast days or special occasions, but the daily drink was mild. In monasteries, for example, monks carefully recorded wine rations, yet the amounts sound large to us because much of it was diluted. It's also worth noting that milk, buttermilk, whey, and herbal infusions were part of medieval diets too. Peasants drank milk products, especially in northern Europe, where cattle and goats were common. Herbal teas and tisanes made with chamomile, mint, or other plants were consumed both for refreshment and medicinal purposes. Fresh juices from fruits like apples and pears were pressed, sometimes fermented into cider, but also consumed fresh. So medieval people had a variety of drinks. Beer and wine were popular, but they were not the only safe options, and water was never absent from the table. In fact, medical texts of the time recommended drinking fresh water, particularly spring water, as healthy. Writers like Hildegard of Bingen or Avicenna in the Islamic world discussed the qualities of water in detail. They clearly didn't think it was universally dangerous. The myth also survives because it fits with the stereotype of the Middle Ages as dirty and unsanitary. To modern audiences, the idea of people avoiding water entirely seems to confirm our assumptions about how backward the period was. But reality is more balanced. Water was vital. Alcohol was common but often weak, and people made thoughtful choices based on local conditions. To sum up, no, medieval people didn't avoid water like poison. They knew how to find good sources, and they drank it regularly. At the same time, small beer and diluted wine provided safe filling, and sometimes more reliable alternatives, especially in crowded towns. But the image of everyone drunk all day long, pure exaggeration. Transition. Now that we've cleared the air about medieval drinks, let's explore another colorful myth idea that knights had to be winched onto their horses because their armor was impossibly heavy. One of the most dramatic images of the Middle Ages is the fully armored knight, so weighed down with steel that he needed a crane or winch to be hoisted onto his horse. You've probably seen it in movies or cartoons, a knight dangling helplessly, armor clanking, as squires struggle to load him into the saddle. It's a funny picture, but it's pure myth. Real knights were far more mobile and practical than that. Let's start with the armor itself. The heaviest type of medieval armor, called plate armor, developed in the late Middle Ages, 14th-15th centuries. A full suit of plate armor typically weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, 18 to 27 kilograms. That may sound heavy, but it's actually comparable to the weight of modern military gear that soldiers carry in combat. Spread evenly over the body, it was manageable. Knights trained from a young age to wear and fight in armor, so they developed the strength and stamina needed to move effectively. Contrary to the myth, knights in plate armor could run, jump, roll, and mount horses on their own. Surviving suits of armor in museums show careful engineering, articulated joints, flexible gauntlets, and smart design that allowed a wide range of movement. Videos of reenactors in authentic reproductions proved this fully armored fighters can climb ladders, swing swords, and yes, leap into the saddle. So where does the crane myth come from? It may have roots in Renaissance and later propaganda. As firearms rose to dominance, plate armor gradually fell out of use. Later writers mocked the earlier era by portraying knights as clumsy relics. Another source of confusion comes from tournament armor, specialized suits made for jousting or ceremonial display. These could weigh more than 80 pounds and were not intended for battlefield use. In rare cases, such armor may have required assistance, but it was the exception, not the rule. On the battlefield, mobility was everything. Knights needed to fight on foot as well as on horseback, march long distances, and adapt quickly. Heavy, impractical armor would have been useless. Archaeological finds from battlefields, such as those at Towton or Visby, show that knights wore armor designed for both protection and agility. In fact, knights could fight dismounted in close combat, without being hopelessly weighed down. Even the horses themselves tell part of the story. War horses known as destriers were powerful animals trained to carry armored riders into battle. Mounting them required skill, but not mechanical devices. Knights used stirrups and mounting blocks when available, just as riders do today. But they could also vault into the saddle when necessary. Chronicles from the time describe knights leaping onto horses in full armor as feats of strength and skill, not impossibilities. It's also worth noting that armor wasn't static. Earlier in the Middle Ages, mail armor chainmail was the norm. A full suit of mail weighed about 20 to 30 pounds and allowed excellent flexibility. As weapon technology advanced, plate was added gradually for better protection. The myth that armor was unbearably heavy oversimplifies this evolution. In reality, armor balanced defense with mobility. So why does the too heavy to mount a horse story survive? Because it's a perfect stereotype. The idea of the lumbering, outdated knight contrasts nicely with the modern image of agility and progress. It also fits Hollywood's love of slapstick knights, tipping over helplessly or being hauled around like statues. But history doesn't back it up. The truth is that medieval knights were elite warriors, athletes of their time. They trained rigorously, maintained fitness, and practiced with weapons and horses daily. Far from being clumsy tin cans, they were among the most effective fighters of the pre-modern world. So next time you hear someone joke about knights needing cranes to get on their horses, you'll know better. Their armor was heavy, yes, but not crippling. It was a marvel of craftsmanship that allowed both protection and surprising freedom of movement. Transition. Now that we've unseated the myth about knights and their armor, let's look at another misconception, this time about medieval justice. The notorious idea that trials were decided by ordeal, like throwing people into rivers to see if they sank or floated. When people imagine medieval justice, they often picture shocking and bizarre ordeals, accused criminals forced to walk across red-hot irons, plunge their arms into boiling water, or be thrown into rivers to see if they would sink or float. The idea is that guilt or innocence was decided not by evidence or witnesses, but by divine judgment. While ordeals did exist, the belief that they were the standard method of trial in the Middle Ages is a myth. The reality of medieval justice was far more complex and, surprisingly, not so different from later legal systems. Let's start with what ordeals actually were. A trial by ordeal was a ritual in which the accused underwent a dangerous or painful test. The outcome was interpreted as a sign of God's will. If the person's wounds healed cleanly, or if they survived unscathed, they were considered innocent. Types of ordeals included the ordeal of hot iron carrying a heated bar, the ordeal of hot water plunging a hand into boiling liquid, and the ordeal of cold water being thrown into water. Floating meant guilt, sinking meant innocence. These practices did happen, but they were far from the everyday norm. Most medieval legal cases were settled in much more ordinary ways. Local courts relied on oaths, witnesses, and community reputation. In smaller disputes, a sworn statement, supported by oath helpers, could clear a person's name. Property cases often depended on written charters or testimony. Even in criminal trials, witnesses and evidence played roles. In other words, the legal system was built on procedure, not constant ordeals. Ordeals were more common in serious or unclear cases, particularly when evidence was lacking and the community couldn't decide. But even then, they weren't random. Ordeals followed strict rituals, often led by priests, and were framed as solemn appeals to divine justice. The Church's involvement is crucial here. Trials by ordeal were believed to be effective only if God's judgment was invoked. So why didn't ordeals dominate the system? For one thing, they were risky. Communities generally preferred peaceful resolution. In fact, records show that many cases were settled before an ordeal could even take place. Sometimes the mere threat of ordeal was enough to push an accused person to confess or negotiate, and when ordeals were carried out, priests often interpreted the results leniently. If someone's wounds healed at all, it was taken as a sign of innocence. A turning point came in 1215, when the Fourth Lateran Council, under Pope Innocent III, forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. Without the Church's blessing, ordeals quickly declined across Europe. Secular courts replaced them with more rational systems. Jury trials in England, inquisitorial investigation in continental Europe, and continued reliance on documents and witnesses. By the 13th century, ordeals were rare exceptions, not standard practice. So where did the myth come from? Partly from sensational chronicles and later writers who highlighted ordeals as colorful examples of medieval backwardness. Early modern critics loved to portray the Middle Ages as superstitious and cruel, contrasting their own enlightened era with what came before. Hollywood films and novels added fuel by depicting ordeals as the main form of justice. All they make for dramatic storytelling. But the real picture is different. Medieval justice was rooted in community, reputation, and law codes. Ordeals existed, but they were limited in scope, heavily ritualized, and eventually abandoned. To say ordeals defined medieval justice is like saying lie detector tests define modern courts. It's a dramatic image, but not the everyday reality. In truth, the Middle Ages laid the groundwork for many of our modern legal principles. Concepts of sworn oaths, jury participation, and written evidence all have medieval roots. The ordeal is just the most sensational piece that captured the imagination of later generations. So next time someone says, medieval people decided guilt by tossing suspects into rivers, you'll know the truth. Ordeals were rare, symbolic, and soon obsolete. Most justice was carried out through much more familiar methods. Transition, with justice myths cleared up. Let's move on to another popular misconception about castles. Were they really cold, damp, and miserable places to live, or is that just another medieval exaggeration? When people imagine life in a medieval castle, they often picture drafty stone halls, freezing rooms, and everyone shivering around a smoky fire. Castles are often portrayed as gloomy, uncomfortable fortresses great for defense, terrible for living. But while castles could be chilly at times, the idea that they were universally miserable to live in is an exaggeration. In fact, castles were not only military strongholds, but also homes designed with comfort, status, and luxury in mind. Let's start with the structure. Yes, castles were built primarily for defense. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, and high towers made them resilient against attacks. Stone retains cold, which is why we often imagine castles as icy inside. But medieval builders weren't clueless. They developed many ways to make life comfortable. For instance, fireplaces and chimneys became widespread by the 12th century. Instead of smoky central hearths, castles had built-in fireplaces in living quarters, each with chimneys to draw the smoke away. This innovation made upper rooms much warmer and more pleasant. Many great halls had huge hearths capable of heating large spaces. Windows also weren't just bare holes in the wall. Wealthy castles featured glazed windows. Glass was expensive, but it was used in elite residences. Even in humbler rooms, windows could be covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or translucent horn panels to block drafts while letting in light. Heavy curtains and tapestries weren't just decorative, they added insulation. Hanging rich fabrics on the walls reduced cold and made rooms visually impressive. Another key detail: floors were not always bare stone. In grand castles, floors might be covered with wooden boards, rushes, or woven mats. Later on, carpets and tapestries imported from the Middle East added warmth and luxury. People also relied on thick furs, blankets, and feather beds for cozy sleeping arrangements. Archaeological finds and inventories list cushions, mattresses, and bed curtains, showing that comfort mattered. Food and feasting were another way castles were far from bleak. The Great Hall wasn't just a military space, it was the heart of social life, filled with music, laughter, and meals. Banquets featured roasted meats, spiced dishes, and sweet pastries, all served with wine or ale. Even everyday meals for lords and ladies were far from dull. Spices like cinnamon, pepper, and saffron, ported through long trade routes, were prized additions. Dining in a castle could be a rich sensory experience. Castles also included gardens, chapels, and private chambers. Lords and ladies enjoyed manicured courtyards and enclosed gardens where they could relax, stroll, and entertain guests. Chapels provided spiritual comfort and often contained beautiful art and stained glass. Personal chambers were decorated with paintings, fabrics, and fine furniture. These were far from bare, dungeon-like spaces. They were designed to display wealth and status. Now, to be fair, not every part of a castle was luxurious. Servants and soldiers often lived in more basic quarters. Kitchens were hot, noisy, and smoky. Storerooms could be damp, and drafty corridors certainly existed. But we shouldn't judge castles only by their most functional spaces. For the elite residents, castles were statements of power and centers of comfortable living. The myth of cold, miserable castles partly comes from visiting ruins today. Modern tourists walk through empty stone shells, stripped of their furnishings, tapestries, and wooden structures. What we see are bare walls, but in the Middle Ages, those walls were richly decorated, heated, and bustling with life. Imagine entering a great hall lit with candles, filled with music, decorated with colorful hangings, and warmed by roaring fires. That's a very different picture from the stereotype of shivering in the dark. It's also important to note that castles evolved. Early Matanbailey structures were indeed more rugged. But by the high and late Middle Ages, castles blended defense with luxury. Some even leaned more toward palatial comfort than fortress function. By the 15th century, many noble families preferred manor houses or palaces, which emphasized style and comfort over military strength. So, were castles cold and uncomfortable? Sometimes, yes, stone is stone, and medieval heating wasn't central heating. But to think of castles only as freezing fortresses ignores the creativity and wealth poured into making them livable and impressive. They were homes, courts, and centers of culture, not just bunkers against attack. Transition, having debunked the myth about castles being miserable, let's turn to another common misconception, that peasants were tied to their villages and never traveled beyond their small patch of land. A common image of medieval life is that peasants were born, lived, and died within a few miles of their village, never traveling, never seeing the world beyond their fields. The stereotype is of simple, isolated people trapped in a static, unchanging existence. While most medieval peasants didn't travel as far or as often as modern tourists, the idea that they never left their villages is simply untrue. In fact, movement and mobility were important parts of medieval society. Let's begin with daily life. True, many peasants lived close to the land, working on farms and owing labor to local lords, but life in the countryside was connected to wider networks. Peasants traveled regularly to markets in nearby towns to sell produce, buy goods, or trade animals. These markets were social as well as economic hubs, drawing people from multiple villages. Some peasants walked miles weekly or monthly to reach them. Religious life also encouraged travel. Pilgrimages were a major feature of the Middle Ages, open not just to nobles but to ordinary people. Peasants saved money and made long journeys to shrines like Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or even Rome and Jerusalem if they were especially devout or fortunate. Pilgrimages offered spiritual rewards, but they also gave peasants a chance to see new lands, meet strangers, and experience other cultures. Seasonal work was another reason peasants moved. During harvest times, or when extra labor was needed, villagers sometimes traveled to neighboring regions to find work. This mobility created opportunities to earn wages outside their immediate community. In fact, records show that some peasants migrated permanently to towns or other estates in search of better living conditions. Fairs were another magnet for travel. Unlike weekly markets, fairs were large, annual events that attracted merchants from across Europe. Famous fairs in Champagne, France, or St. Ives, England, brought together cloth, spices, and luxury goods from as far as Italy or the Middle East. Peasants attended these fairs not only to trade, but also to enjoy the festive atmosphere, music, and entertainment. For many villagers, fairs were highlights of the year, and they required traveling significant distances. War and service also contributed to movement. Some peasants were recruited as soldiers, archers, or support staff in armies. Campaigns took them far from home, sometimes across countries. Others joined construction projects, such as building cathedrals, castles, or bridges, which could take years and draw laborers from many regions. These opportunities expanded horizons far beyond the local village. Another point often overlooked is marriage and family ties. Peasants sometimes married people from neighboring villages, requiring them to move. Daughters might relocate to serve in wealthier households as maids or servants, while sons might work as apprentices in towns. These movements wove peasants into broader social and economic networks. The idea of peasants being chained to their land partly comes from the system of serfdom. It's true that serfs were legally bound to the estates of their lords and couldn't move freely without permission. But even serfs weren't totally immobile. Lords often granted leave for travel, especially for markets, fairs, or pilgrimages, because such activities benefited the economy. And not all peasants were serfs. Many were free tenants who enjoyed greater mobility. So why does the myth persist? Partly because later historians and writers painted the Middle Ages as stagnant in contrast to the modern world. The image of peasants trapped in their villages serves as a convenient symbol of backwardness. But surviving documents, court records, travel permits, market rolls tell a different story. They reveal peasants who traveled regularly, engaged with wider trade, and even undertook long journeys. Of course, we shouldn't imagine peasants as medieval globetrotters. Most didn't travel across countries or continents, but compared to the stereotype of never leaving home, the reality shows much more movement. For medieval peasants, travel was often a necessity, economic, religious, or social. Villages were connected nodes in a broader medieval world, not isolated islands. So, were peasants stuck forever in their villages? Not at all. They walked to markets, joined pilgrimages, worked on distant projects, visited fairs, and sometimes even crossed borders. Travel was woven into their lives in ways we often underestimate. Transition, having seen how medieval peasants were more mobile than the stereotype suggests, let's turn to another misconception, this time about health. Was medieval medicine really nothing more than superstition and potions brewed by ignorant healers? When people think of medieval medicine, they often picture quacks waving herbs, chanting spells, or bleeding patients with leeches. The stereotype is that medicine in the Middle Ages was nothing more than superstition and ignorance, with no real science behind it. While it's true that some medieval practices may seem strange to us today, the idea that medicine was only superstition is a myth. In fact, medieval medicine was a complex mix of ancient knowledge, religious belief, practical experience, and early scientific observation. Let's start with the foundations. Much of medieval European medicine was based on the writings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, especially Hippocrates and Galen. Their theories of the four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile shaped medical thinking for centuries. Illness, it was believed, came from an imbalance of these humours, and treatments aimed to restore balance. This might involve bloodletting, purging, or changes in diet. To modernize, it may sound unscientific, but it was a rational system built on observation and logic as understood at the time. Religion also played a role. Since Christianity shaped medieval European life, many believed illness could be a punishment from God or a test of faith. Prayer, pilgrimages, and relics were sometimes used as healing methods. Yet this doesn't mean people rejected practical medicine. Hospitals, many founded by monasteries, provided not just spiritual care but also food, shelter, and treatment. Monks and nuns cultivated herb gardens and compiled medical texts. Far from being centers of superstition, monasteries were key to preserving and advancing medical knowledge. Herbal medicine was another cornerstone. Medieval people used plants with real healing properties, many of which are still recognized today. Willow bark was used to reduce pain and fever. It contained salicin, the basis of aspirin. Garlic was used as an antiseptic. Mint, fennel, and chamomile treated digestive issues. Far from being random superstition, this was empirical knowledge built up through generations of experience. We also have to look beyond Europe. In the medieval period, the Islamic world made tremendous advances in medicine. Scholars like Avicenna ibn Sina wrote influential works such as the Canon of Medicine, which became a standard text in both the Middle East and Europe for centuries. Muslim physicians performed surgeries, developed pharmacies, and emphasized clinical observation. Through translation movements in Spain and Sicily, this knowledge spread to Europe and enriched medieval medical practice. Surgery itself wasn't absent from medieval Europe either. Figures like Guy de Chauliac, a French physician in the 14th century, wrote surgical manuals that guided practitioners for generations. Surgeons performed procedures like setting bones, removing cataracts, and even trepanning, drilling into the skull with surprising skill. While they lacked anesthesia and antiseptics, they weren't merely butchers. They applied systematic techniques and sometimes achieved successful outcomes. Public health measures also existed. During outbreaks like the Black Death, people didn't fully understand germs, but they noticed patterns. Quarantine was introduced in Italian cities like Venice. Ships had to wait 40 days quaranta giorni before passengers could disembark. Towns attempted to regulate cleanliness, remove waste, and controlled the spread of disease. These measures reflect observation and communal response, not blind superstition. That said, not everything was effective. Some treatments, like wearing amulets or relying on astrology, did have more to do with belief than science. Bloodletting, while based on humor theory, was often harmful. Superstition certainly coexisted with medicine, but it wasn't the whole story. Medieval healers combined spiritual, herbal, and practical approaches in ways that made sense given their knowledge base. The myth that medieval medicine was only superstition comes from looking back with modern standards compared to today's advanced hospitals, antibiotics, and vaccines. Their practices seem primitive, but for their time, medieval medicine represented the best available system of care. More importantly, it laid foundations for later medical progress. Without the preservation of ancient texts, the refinement of herbal remedies, and the contributions of both European and Islamic scholars, the medical revolution of the Renaissance and beyond might not have been possible. So, was medieval medicine just superstition? Not at all. It was a blend of tradition, observation, and faith, with real knowledge alongside mistaken ideas. While far from perfect, it provided care, comfort, and cures for millions over centuries. Transition. Now that we've cleared up the myths about medicine, let's tackle another dramatic misconception: the belief that witch burnings were everywhere. In the Middle Ages, were medieval people really obsessed with hunting down witches? When people picture the Middle Ages, they often imagine crowds gathering in village squares to watch accused witches burned at the stake. The stereotype suggests that Europe was gripped by constant witch hunts, with thousands of women persecuted for sorcery. But this picture doesn't match the historical reality of the medieval period. In truth, widespread witch burnings were a phenomenon of the early modern period, mainly the 16th and 17th centuries, not the Middle Ages. Let's begin with medieval attitudes toward magic. In the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church generally denied that witchcraft had real power. Belief in magic and sorcery existed, but the Church often dismissed it as superstition or the result of deception by the devil. A famous church text, the Canon Episcopi, stated that women who thought they flew at night with pagan goddesses were simply deluded. In other words, witchcraft was often treated as false belief, not a crime requiring execution. When magic was punished, it was usually in specific cases such as harmful curses or poisoning rather than generalized witch hunts. Accusations often blended with concerns about heresy, but they were relatively rare. For most of the medieval period, accusations of sorcery did not spark mass trials or executions. So where does the image of burning witches come from? It largely stems from the later Middle Ages into the Renaissance. In the 15th century, attitudes began to shift. Scholars and church authorities grew more concerned about heresy and diabolic influence. A key turning point came in 1486 with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum Hammer of Witches by Heinrich Kramer. This book described witches as dangerous agents of the devil who should be rooted out and punished. It fueled fear and provided justification for witch hunts, but its real impact came in the following centuries. In fact, many of the largest and most brutal witch trials occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries, well after the Middle Ages had ended. Areas like Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland saw mass executions, sometimes involving hundreds of victims in a single region. These hunts were fueled by religious conflict, social upheaval, and early modern state authority, not by medieval culture. During the actual Middle Ages, punishment for magic varied. Some individuals were fined, imprisoned, or occasionally executed, but such cases were relatively isolated. Burning at the stake was a punishment usually reserved for heretics, not witches. Even when executions occurred, they were rare compared to the massive panics of later centuries. It's also worth noting that not all forms of magic were condemned. White magic, or helpful practices like healing charms, protective amulets, or fertility rituals, was often tolerated or even relied upon in rural communities. Cunning folk and wise women sometimes played important roles as local healers. The line between accepted and forbidden practices was blurry. So why do we associate witch burnings with the Middle Ages? Partly because popular culture blurs time. Films, novels, and folklore often compress centuries into one vague medieval past. Since witch trials are dramatic and terrifying, they get projected backward into the Middle Ages. Even though they belong more to the Renaissance and early modern era, the reality is more nuanced in the early Middle Ages. Witchcraft was often dismissed as superstition. In the High Middle Ages, isolated cases of sorcery were prosecuted, usually when linked to harm or heresy. The stereotype of mass burnings only really exploded in the 16th and 17th centuries. Understanding this helps us see the Middle Ages not as a time of endless witch parties, but as a period when beliefs about magic were still being defined. The obsession with organized witchcraft as a satanic conspiracy was a later development. So, were witch burnings everywhere in the Middle Ages? Definitely not. While magic was sometimes feared and punished, the mass hunts that haunt our imagination came later. The Middle Ages had their share of superstition and fear, but the image of constant witch burnings belongs to a different era. Transition, having separated myth from reality about witches. Let's now turn to another misconception about medieval life: the belief that everyone died at age 30. Did people really have such short lifespans? One of the most common misconceptions about the Middle Ages is that people rarely lived past the age of 30. The stereotype is of a short, brutal life where death came shockingly early. When we hear that the average life expectancy was around 30 or 35, it sounds like medieval people must have been old and grey by their late 20s, but the truth is more complicated. While life could indeed be harsh, people did not simply drop dead at 30. In fact, many lived into their 50s, 60s, or even older. So where does the myth come from? It's rooted in how statistics are interpreted. When historians say the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was around 30, that number includes infant and child mortality. And here's the key: infant mortality was extremely high. A huge number of children died before the age of 5 due to disease, poor nutrition, or accidents. These tragic losses pulled the average down dramatically. For example, imagine a village where half the children die before age 5, but the adults who survive childhood often live into their 60s. The average lifespan might be around 30, but that doesn't mean adults were elderly at 30. It simply means childhood was perilous. Once someone survived into their teenage years, their chances of living to middle age or beyond improved greatly. We have plenty of evidence of older medieval people. Documents mention elders advising villagers, running businesses, or entering monasteries at advanced ages. Tombstones and church records show individuals living into their 70s and 80s. In fact, some medieval kings, nobles, and church leaders reached what we would consider a respectable old age today. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine lived into her 80s, an astonishing age even by modern standards. That's not to say life was easy. Medieval people faced many dangers we take for granted today. Plagues, famines, and wars could strike unpredictably. The Black Death of the 14th century wiped out massive populations, killing young and old alike. Epidemics of smallpox, dysentery, and influenza cut lives short. Medical care, while more advanced than often assumed, was limited compared to today. And childbirth was especially dangerous for women, with high maternal mortality rates. Nutrition also played a role. Peasants often lived on grain-heavy diets, with limited access to meat or fresh vegetables in winter. This could lead to deficiencies that weakened health over time. Yet medieval people were not constantly starving. Harvests varied, and many communities thrived in good years. Work conditions were tough, especially for laborers. Farming, building, or crafting could wear down the body. Injuries that are minor today, like a broken leg, could be life-threatening without proper medical intervention. These challenges certainly reduced the number of people reaching old age, but they did not make 30 a natural limit. It's also worth noting that perceptions of age were different. Turning 40 or 50 was seen as reaching seniority, but not necessarily as being frail. Elders often played important roles in families and communities, passing down wisdom, managing property, and caring for grandchildren. Old age was recognized and respected, even if fewer people reached it compared to today. So why does the myth persist? Partly because average lifespan is misunderstood. The number sounds shocking and makes the Middle Ages seem grim and primitive. Popular culture reinforces the idea, with films and TV shows portraying everyone as young and doomed. But looking closely at the evidence reveals a fuller picture. The truth is, many medieval people lived long lives, especially if they survived childhood, avoided major plagues, and weren't caught in war. 30 was not an expiration date, it was simply the midpoint of a life shaped by different challenges than ours today. So, did everyone die at 30 in the Middle Ages? Not at all. While childhood mortality lowered averages, adults often lived into their 50s or beyond. Life was fragile, yes, but not as brutally short as the myth suggests. Transition, with lifespan myths cleared up. Let's move to our final misconception, the idea that medieval food was bland and tasteless. Were their diets really so dull, or were they spicier and more varied than we imagine? And there we have it, 16 of the most common myths about the Middle Ages, broken down and put into perspective. From the idea that people thought the earth was flat, to the belief that nobody bathed, to the stereotype of short lives and bland food. We've seen how many of our assumptions are shaped more by Hollywood and old stereotypes than by actual history. The truth is that the Middle Ages were neither a time of total ignorance nor a period of constant misery. Yes, life could be harsh, and yes, people faced challenges that we, with modern medicine and technology, can hardly imagine. But they were also innovative, resilient, and far more complex than the clichés suggest. we've discovered that medieval people valued learning, preserved ancient knowledge, traveled widely, experimented with medicine, and enjoyed surprisingly flavorful food. They built cathedrals that still amaze us today, created works of art and literature that continue to inspire, and developed communities that laid the foundations for much of modern Europe. Why does this matter? Because understanding history means moving beyond stereotypes. When we dismiss the Middle Ages as nothing but darkness and superstition, we miss out on the richness of human experience during those centuries. By challenging myths, we not only give justice to the people of the past, but also gain a clearer perspective on how societies evolve. So, the next time someone tells you that people in the Middle Ages were dirty, ignorant, or doomed to die, 30, you'll know better. The reality is much more fascinating, and much more human. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval myths. History, after all, is never as simple as the stories we tell, but it's always worth exploring.